On the 8th of August, 1972, in a quiet corner of San Francisco, a 40-year-old man was found gone beneath a second-story apartment window. He had fallen. That much was certain. But almost nothing else about that night ever was. Was it a tragic accident? A deliberate act of a man who had run out of road? Or something darker still? The truth was never officially resolved, and to this day, no clean answer has ever been written into the record. The man's name was Eddie Machen, and if you followed heavyweight boxing in the golden years of the sport, you knew that name well. Because this was not some anonymous soul lost to the city. This was once one of the most feared, most disciplined heavyweight contenders in all of America. A thinking man's fighter, a boxer so skilled, so cool under pressure, that he did something almost no one else on earth could do. He stood across the ring from the terrifying Sonny Liston and went the full distance, still standing at the final bell. And yet, here he was, 40 years old, broke, haunted by an illness the world barely understood in those days. Gone in a fall that the newspapers could only describe with a single, careful word. The following morning, the 9th of August, 1972, the New York Times ran his obituary.
The headline told readers that Eddie Machen, 40, a heavyweight, had passed away, an ex-contender who, in the paper's own word, plummeted from a window. Weeks later, Time magazine recorded his passing in its milestones column, noting both the mental struggles that had shadowed his final years and the fact that no one truly knew how his life had ended. So how does a fighter this gifted fall this far? How does a man who conquered the ring lose the fight that mattered most? And why, more than half a century later, does the ending still refuse to give up its secrets? To understand the fall, we have to go back to the beginning.
Because before he became the man who fell from that window, Eddie Machen was a boy from a mail carrier's home in Redding, California, and his very first real fight was not in a ring at all. It was with the law. Edward Mills Machen came into the world on the 15th of June, 1932, in Redding, California. It was a hard year to be born into. The Great Depression was crushing families across the country, and Northern California was no exception. Money was thin, work was scarce, and survival was a daily effort. Eddie was one of 6 children. His father was a rural mail carrier, the kind of steady, honest job that carried enormous weight in a struggling town. That postal route was the anchor of the entire household. Rain or shine, it put food on the table for 8 people, and in a large working-class family during those years, that modest paycheck was the difference between getting by and going without. Picture the world that shaped him, a big family under one roof, a father out on the roads, delivering the mail that connected an isolated Northern California community to the wider world. Little privacy, little luxury, and a lot of mouths to feed. It was a childhood built on discipline and doing without. And for a boy with ambition burning inside him, it was also a childhood he would eventually want to escape. Boxing in that era was one of the few real ladders a poor young man could climb. It didn't ask where you came from. It didn't care that your father delivered letters or that you shared a home with 5 siblings. In the ring, all that mattered was whether you could fight. And for young men without money, without connections, without an easy path forward, that promise was intoxicating. The gym became a place where a kid could be somebody, where raw talent could turn into a name people knew. For Eddie Machen,
boxing became both escape and identity, a way out of the ordinary, a way to matter. But the path from a Depression-era home in Reading to a professional prize-fighting career was never a straight line. And before boxing could save him, Eddie took a wrong turn that would define the fear he carried for the rest of his life.
After only 3 amateur fights, he found himself on the wrong side of the justice system. He was still just a young man, testing himself in the amateur ranks, when everything nearly came apart before it began. Eddie Machen had dropped out of high school and thrown himself into boxing as an amateur. But he had only 3 amateur bouts to his name, barely enough to call himself a fighter at all, when he was arrested and convicted of armed robbery. It was a run-in with the law that would follow him in one way or another for the rest of his days. The conviction sent him into confinement, and that experience left a mark far deeper than any bruise a boxing glove could leave.
For a young man of barely 20, locked away and cut off from the world, it was a defining and frightening chapter. And it planted something inside him that never fully went away, a private dread of ever being caged again. We should be careful here, because the surviving record tells us the facts without the fine detail. What we know is this: he made a serious mistake as a very young man. He paid for it with time in confinement, and when he came out, he was a changed person with a singular, burning purpose. Because after his release, Eddie Machen turned to professional boxing, and he did it with a determination that bordered on desperation. He was not simply chasing fame or fortune. He was running from something.
He had decided, with everything in him, that he would never return to confinement again. That vow became the engine behind his entire career. Every early morning in the gym, every punishing round, every step up the ladder, all of it was fueled by a man who had seen the alternative and refused to go back. It gave him a discipline that most fighters could only dream of. When you are boxing not just for money, but for your freedom and your self-respect, you train differently. You sacrifice differently. And Eddie did exactly that. The frightened young man who had once made a terrible choice was about to reinvent himself as one of the most polished heavyweights in the country.
On the 22nd of March, 1955, Eddie Machen walked into a professional ring for the very first time, and what happened over the next 12 months would make the entire sport take notice. When Eddie Machen made his professional debut on the 22nd of March, 1955, he did not ease into the fight game. He tore into it. That first year was nothing short of astonishing. He fought 11 times in 1955 alone, and he won every single one of them. 10 of those 11 victories came by knockout or technical knockout, not close decisions, not lucky escapes, emphatic finishing performances that announced a new force in the heavyweight division.
Now, on paper, Eddie was not built like the monsters people imagined when they thought of a heavyweight. He stood 6 feet tall and carried around 195 pounds. In a division that would soon be filled with towering giants, he was not the biggest man in the room. But what he lacked in raw size, he more than made up for in skill. He was fast-handed, technically sharp, and disciplined in a way that reflected everything he had been through to get there. That discipline was his signature. This was a man who had trained like his freedom depended on it, because in his own mind, it had. And it showed. He didn't just overpower opponents. He outthought them. He picked them apart. He fought with a cool, calculating intelligence that separated him from the brawlers around him. The 11-win year of 1955 was only the beginning of something remarkable, because Eddie Machen would keep on winning,
and winning and winning. He rolled up victory after victory until he had strung together his first 24 consecutive professional bouts without a single loss. 24 in a row. In the brutal, unforgiving world of heavyweight boxing, that kind of run does not happen by accident. It happens because a fighter is the real thing. The boxing world began to sit up and pay attention. Managers took notice. Sports writers started mentioning his name.
The kid from Reading, the one who had once found himself in serious trouble with the law, was now a genuine prospect on the rise, a disciplined, dangerous heavyweight climbing steadily toward the top of a crowded division. By 1957, Eddie was no longer just a promising prospect. After beating a former world champion not once but twice, the boxing establishment could no longer afford to ignore him. The moment that turned Eddie Machen from a rising name into a true contender came against a man who had already sat on top of the world. By 1957, Machen had defeated Joey Maxim, the former light heavyweight champion of the world, and he had done it twice. Beating a former world champion once will get you noticed. Beating him twice will get you ranked. And that is exactly what happened. Those victories vaulted Eddie Machen into the ranks of legitimate heavyweight contenders. It's worth understanding just how difficult that climb was in the late 1950s. The heavyweight division in those years was crowded and fiercely competitive, arguably one of the deepest talent pools the sport had ever seen. It was an era filled with skilled, hungry black fighters, many of them battling not only each other in the ring, but also a system that tightly controlled who got the big paydays and who got the coveted shots at a championship. For a fighter like Machen, that meant the fight was never just against the man in front of him. It was against the politics of the sport itself, the managers, the promoters, the invisible machinery that decided which contenders were allowed near a title and which were kept waiting in line. In that world, you couldn't just be good. You had to be undeniable. And so Eddie made himself exactly that. His calling card was his mind. Eddie Machen was above all a thinking man's boxer. He was not a wild slugger who won on ferocity alone. He was a hit-and-move technician, a fighter who studied his opponent, controlled the distance, and dismantled his rivals with skill and ring intelligence rather than sheer brute force. He beat you with his brain as much as his fists. In a division full of dangerous punchers, that cerebral style made him one of the most respected craftsmen in the game. He had come so far. From a Depression-era home in Reading, through a frightening brush with confinement, to the very edge of heavyweight boxing's elite. Everything seemed to be pointing upward. The wins were piling up, the ranking was climbing, and the dream of a world title no longer felt impossible. But 1958 would deliver the first cruel lesson of his career. A night in Sweden where a single punch sent him crashing to the canvas 3 times and left him motionless for minutes. 1958 opened with Eddie Machen doing exactly what a top contender is supposed to do, proving himself against elite competition. In April of that year, he stepped into the ring with Zora Foley, one of the most highly ranked heavyweights in the world. This was no tune-up. Foley was a serious, skilled fighter, and the two men went the full 12 rounds to a hard-fought draw. To many observers, that result said everything you needed to know about Eddie Machen. He could stand toe-to-toe with the best in the division and match them round for round on pure skill. No knockdowns to bail him out, no fluke. Just 12 rounds of high-level heavyweight boxing against a man near the top of the rankings. He walked out of that fight with his reputation intact and his standing secure. Everything still pointed upward. And then, that September, the sport handed him a lesson so brutal that it would change the way people saw him, and perhaps the way he saw himself. His opponent was Ingemar Johansson, the undefeated Swede who was on his own collision course with the World Championship. The fight took place in Sweden, in front of a crowd that adored the rising local hero. And what unfolded was almost too quick to comprehend. Johansson caught Eddie flush with a thunderous right hand, the very punch that would soon make him famous around the world. Machen went down. He got up. He went down again.
And then, a third time, he crashed to the canvas. And this time, he did not rise for what felt like an eternity. He lay motionless for several long minutes. The whole thing was over in a single round. Try to imagine what that does to a fighter like Eddie Machen. Here was a man who had built his entire identity on discipline, on control, on outthinking everyone in front of him. He had never truly known losing. And now, in front of a foreign crowd, his gifts had been erased in a matter of seconds by one devastating blow. It was more than a defeat on the record. It was a public unraveling of the invincibility he had carefully constructed. For the first time, the boxing world saw that the cool, calculating craftsman could be broken.
And somewhere behind that disciplined exterior, a seed of vulnerability had been planted, one that no highlight reel would ever show. A lesser fighter might have vanished after a knockout like that. But in 1959, Eddie Machen answered with something almost nobody expected. There is a certain kind of courage that never makes the front pages. It's not the courage it takes to walk into a ring. Plenty of men can do that once. It's the courage it takes to walk back in after the whole world has watched you fall. That was the challenge facing Eddie Machen as 1959 began. The devastating loss to Johansson was still fresh. The questions were loud. Was the cerebral contender from Reading finished? Had that one punch exposed something that couldn't be fixed? Eddie answered the only way he knew how. He went back to work. And what followed was one of the most quietly impressive stretches of his entire career. Over the course of 1959, Machen strung together 7 consecutive victories, methodically rebuilding everything the Johansson fight had threatened to tear down. 7 wins in a row. Not against nobodies, but against the kind of competition a top 10 heavyweight had to beat to stay relevant. With each victory, he clawed his way back up the rankings and reasserted himself as a genuine force in the division. The hit-and-move technician was back, sharper, more focused, and determined to remind everyone exactly who he was. And here is where you begin to see the pattern that would come to define his entire life. Eddie Machen was a man who fell and rose again. It happened in the ring in 1959, when a career-threatening knockout was answered with a 7-fight winning streak. And it would happen in far more private and painful ways in the years still to come. This rhythm of collapse and resurrection ran through everything he touched. For now, though, the story was pure redemption. By the close of the decade, he had done the hard thing. He had not let one terrible night in Sweden define him. He had rebuilt his name, one disciplined performance at a time, and he stood once again among the elite contenders of the heavyweight division, poised to enter the 1960s with real momentum. But climbing back to the top comes with a price. It puts you back in line for the biggest fights, the most dangerous fights. And in September of 1960, Eddie Machen would step into the ring with the most feared man in all of boxing. What he did across from Sonny Liston would become the quiet legend of his career. To understand what Eddie Machen accomplished in September of 1960, you first have to understand the man standing across from him. Sonny Liston was, quite simply, the most terrifying figure in boxing. He was a wrecking machine, a fighter with brutal one-punch power who left a trail of unconscious opponents in his wake. When Liston looked across the ring at you, most men were beaten before the opening bell. He didn't just win fights, he ended them, violently and early. Contenders lined up to face him, not because they wanted to, but because he stood squarely between them and a shot at the title. And one by one, the top men of the division met the same fate. They fell. They were knocked out, flattened by the sheer force of him. And then there was Eddie Machen. When these two men met over 12 rounds, Liston won a unanimous decision. On the scorecards, it was a clear victory for the future champion. But what happened inside those 12 rounds is what made this fight unforgettable, and what earned Machen a place in the sport's quiet legend. Because Eddie Machen did what no other top contender of that era managed to do against Sonny Liston. He survived. He went the full distance. When the final bell rang, he was still on his feet. Think about that. Among the elite contenders Liston beat on his march toward the championship, Machen was the only one he could not knock out. Everyone else fell. Eddie stood. He did it with his mind, with the hit-and-move discipline that was his signature, controlling the distance, refusing to be drawn into the kind of exchange that had destroyed so many others. It was a masterclass in survival against overwhelming force. There was controversy woven through the night as well. Liston was penalized 3 times during the fight for low blows, a detail that has always lingered around this bout, raising questions about just how the fight was fought and whether it might have been closer than the official verdict suggested. The way Eddie survived Liston would enter boxing lore. Some would later claim that even Muhammad Ali's camp studied that fight as they prepared for their own showdown with the fearsome champion, though that remains a piece of boxing folklore rather than a firmly documented fact. But at the very moment Eddie proved his greatness, something inside him was beginning to break. Here is the cruelest turn in the entire story of Eddie Machen. At the peak of his professional respect, a man who had just gone the distance with the most feared heavyweight alive, he was quietly losing a fight that no crowd would ever cheer, a fight that had no referee and no final bell. In the fall of 1962, Eddie Machen was admitted to the Napa State Hospital. The reason was chilling in its simplicity. He had reached a point of profound crisis, no longer sure he could go on. We have to handle this part of his story with great care, because the surviving record tells us what happened without pretending to know everything he felt. What the biographies make clear is this: Eddie Machen was a man in the grip of serious mental illness. He suffered from clinical depression, a darkness that had settled over him and grew heavier as the pressures of his life mounted. This was not weakness. It was not a character flaw. It was an illness, as real and as dangerous as any injury he ever took in the ring. But here is what makes it so heartbreaking. In the early 1960s, the world had almost no language for what Eddie was going through. Mental illness carried a deep and cruel stigma. Men were expected to be tough, silent, unbreakable, and a professional heavyweight fighter most of all. There were no support systems designed for someone like him. No open conversations, no understanding public. A black contender battling an invisible opponent in an era that barely acknowledged that opponent existed had almost nowhere to turn. Imagine the isolation of it. In the ring, Eddie always knew his enemy. He could study an opponent, measure the distance, outthink the danger. But this was different.
This was an enemy inside his own mind, one he could not outbox, could not outmove, could not outrun with discipline and training. The very tools that had made him great in the ring were useless against it. That admission to Napa State Hospital was a signal that something was profoundly wrong beneath the surface of a man the public still saw as a tough, composed prizefighter.
He would return to the ring, but the man who came back was fighting on two fronts now. And by 1964, the private struggle was quietly eating away at the career he had bled for. For most of his career, Eddie Machen had been one of the busiest men in the heavyweight division. 11 fights in a single year at the start, streak after streak, always active, always climbing. So when you look at what happened to his schedule in 1964, the numbers themselves tell a quiet, painful story. That year, Eddie Machen fought only twice. For a fighter of his caliber, a man who had once treated the ring like a second home, 2 bouts in an entire year was almost unheard of.
The record simply notes that he was battling personal issues, a careful phrase that hints at just how much was happening away from the cameras and the crowds. We should be honest about the limits of what the surviving record confirms. It does not spell out every detail of what he was wrestling with in 1964. But we know the shadow that had been following him. We know about the darkness that had led to Napa State Hospital just 2 years earlier. And we can see, plainly, in that shrunken fight schedule, the toll it was taking. One of those 2 fights, though, showed that the craftsman was still very much alive inside him. In July of 1964, Machen traveled to Sweden, the same country where Johansson had once flattened him in a single round. And this time, he stood across the ring from Floyd Patterson, the former heavyweight champion of the world. It was a genuine measuring stick, one former or future champion against a proven contender. Machen lost, but only just. It was a close 12-round decision, the kind of narrow defeat that tells you a fighter still belonged at the highest level. Even while battling an invisible opponent away from the ring, even fighting on 2 fronts at once, Eddie Machen could still go the distance with a former world champion and make him earn every round. That was the tragedy and the greatness of him, wrapped together. His body and his skill were still world-class. It was everything happening inside that was slipping. You can only imagine what it took to prepare for a fighter like Patterson while carrying that private weight. The training, the focus, the discipline, all summoned by a man who was quietly hurting in ways almost no one around him understood. Then, in 1965, after a decade of near misses and one long, punishing climb, the door Eddie Machen had been chasing his entire life finally opened. His one and only shot at a world championship was about to arrive. For 10 long years, Eddie Machen had chased a single thing. Through the winning streaks and the brutal knockouts, through the comebacks and the private battles no one could see, one goal had pulled him forward: a world championship. And in 1965, at long last, the door swung open. The way that door opened tells you everything about the turbulent times he was living through. The World Boxing Association heavyweight title was vacant, stripped from Muhammad Ali in one of the most explosive moments in the history of the sport. And into that vacuum stepped Eddie Machen, suddenly placed at the center of a politically charged fight for a piece of history. His opponent was Ernie Terrell, a towering giant who stood 6 foot 6 inches tall. For a fighter who had spent his whole career giving up size and using his mind to close the gap, this was the ultimate test of that philosophy. Terrell had reach, height, and a long, awkward style that gave shorter men nightmares. Picture what this meant to Eddie, a boy from a mail carrier's home in Reading, a young man who had once feared he'd thrown his future away, a fighter who had survived Sonny Liston and clawed back from devastating losses more than once. Now, finally, he was fighting for the crown that had eluded him for a decade. The fight went the full championship distance, 15 grueling rounds, and once again, Eddie Machen did what defined him. He endured. He did not fold, did not crumble, did not get stopped.
He stood in there for all 15 rounds against a much larger man with a world title on the line. But when the final bell rang, the decision went to Terrell. Eddie had gone the distance one more time, just as he had against Liston, just as he had against Patterson. Yet the reward he wanted most slipped through his fingers. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that pattern. Time and again, Eddie Machen proved he could last with anyone in the sport. But surviving was not the same as winning the ultimate prize. He was always there at the end, still standing, still fighting, yet the crown itself always belonged to someone else. The title dream was over. He would never get another chance at it.
Here is one of the great cruelties of the fight game, and it has claimed more men than any single opponent ever could. A boxer can spend his entire life generating enormous sums of money, filling arenas, drawing crowds, earning purses that would seem like fortunes to ordinary working people, and still end up with nothing to show for it. In 1966, Eddie Machen filed for bankruptcy. Let that settle for a moment. This was a fighter who had shared the ring with Sonny Liston, Floyd Patterson, Ingemar Johansson, and Ernie Terrell, a man ranked among the very best heavyweights on the planet for years, a contender for the championship of the world.
And yet, financially, he had reached the point where he could no longer keep himself afloat. The surviving record does not hand us the fine details, the exact figures, the specific debts, precisely how the money slipped away. What we can say is that Eddie's financial collapse fits a heartbreaking and all too common pattern of his era. It was a world with few protections for the men who did the bleeding. Purses were split and shaved by all the hands reaching in around a fighter. When the winnings slowed, so did the money. But the bills did not. For too many great fighters of that generation, the story ended the same way. For Eddie, the timing made it all the more painful.
He was already carrying the weight of a private illness, the disappointment of a championship that had slipped away, and now the stress of financial ruin on top of it all. Each blow landed on a man who was already carrying more than most people could imagine. And yet, even amid the wreckage, even with his money gone and his best years behind him, he still had a little brilliance left inside the ropes. The craftsman was not quite finished. Before the lights went dark on his career, Eddie Machen had one more moment of the old magic left in him. In 1966, he faced a young, hungry, undefeated fighter named Jerry Quarry, a rising star with a spotless professional record. But that night, he ran into a master.
Eddie Machen, battered by life and closing in on the end of his run, reached back into everything he knew and beat him. He handed Jerry Quarry the first loss of his entire professional career. Think about what that says. Here was a fighter carrying financial ruin, private illness, and years of hard mileage, and he could still summon enough of the old skill to spoil the record of one of the most promising young heavyweights in the country. The hit-and-move craftsman was still in there somewhere. It was proof that the greatness had never fully left him. It had only grown harder and harder to reach. But the sport is merciless. Later that same year, Eddie stepped in with another rising force, a ferocious young fighter named Joe Frazier, who was climbing toward a championship destiny of his own. Frazier's relentless pressure and youth were too much, and the fight was stopped in the 10th round. The distance Eddie had always managed to go now had a limit. The end came in 1967, following a run of defeats to Henry Clark, to Boone Kirkman, and to Joe Frazier. Eddie Machen walked away from the ring for good. He retired at the age of 35. When it was all over, the record told the story of a remarkable career. 64 professional fights, 50 victories, nearly 30 of those wins by knockout. A resume filled with the biggest names of a golden era: Liston, Patterson, Johansson, Terrell, Foley, Maxim, Corey, Frazier. This was no journeyman. This was one of the finest heavyweights of his time, a man who had shared the ring with legends, and more often than not, made them work for every second. But a fighter's record does not follow him home. And at 35, with no championship, no fortune, and a private illness that had never released its grip, Eddie Machen walked away from the only life he had ever really known. When a great fighter retires, the world tends to look away. The crowds move on to the next contender, the next big fight, the next fresh face. And for a man who had defined himself by the ring for so long, that silence can be its own kind of danger. The years after 1967 were quiet ones for Eddie Machen. Perhaps too quiet. He faded from the spotlight. Gone were the ranking battles, the championship stage. In their place was the difficult, ordinary business of living with everything that had come before. He carried the aftermath of his financial collapse. He carried still the weight of the long illness that had shadowed him for more than a decade. The invisible opponent from his fighting days had never left. It had simply followed him into retirement, into the silence, where there were no cheering crowds to distract from it. We do not have a detailed record of those final years, and we should not fill that silence with invention. And then came the 8th of August, 1972. On that day, in San Francisco, Eddie Machen was found gone. He had fallen from a second-story apartment window. He was 40 years old. Here we must tread with great care, because this is the part of the story where the record itself goes silent, and honesty demands that we let it. The exact circumstances of that fall were never officially resolved. Was it a tragic accident? Was it the heartbreaking outcome of a man who had run out of strength for the long, private fight he had waged for so many years? The plain truth is that no one ever established the answer with certainty. It remains, to this day, an open question. We will not pretend to know what happened in those final moments. To do so would dishonor both the facts and the man. The following morning, the 9th of August, 1972, the New York Times reported his passing. Weeks later, Time magazine noted his passing in its milestones column, acknowledging both the mental struggles of his final years and the unresolved nature of his end. No headline, no short paragraph could tell the world what really unfolded that night. And that silence, that unanswered question, is exactly where the deeper questions begin. So how do we measure a life like this one? Not by the fall, never by the fall alone. Because to reduce Eddie Machen to the tragedy of his final chapter would be to miss almost everything that made him remarkable. Consider what he actually did. 64 professional fights, 50 won, nearly 30 by knockout. He shared the ring with an astonishing roster of the greatest heavyweights of a golden age,
the fearsome Sonny Liston, the champion Floyd Patterson, the powerful Ingemar Johansson, the towering Ernie Terrell, the skilled Zora Foley, the veteran Joey Maxim, and the rising stars Jerry Quarry and Joe Frazier. That is not the record of a footnote. That is the record of a genuine great.
And his signature achievement still stands as one of the quiet marvels of the sport. When Sonny Liston was cutting a terrifying path through the division, flattening top contenders one after another, it was Eddie Machen, and Eddie Machen alone among that elite group, who refused to fall. He went the full distance with the most dangerous man in boxing, still on his feet at the final bell. That single accomplishment tells you everything about his courage, his intelligence, and his extraordinary discipline. But there is a deeper reason his story deserves to be remembered. Eddie Machen was fighting battles the cameras never captured. In an era when mental illness was met with silence and shame, when there was almost no language and even less compassion for what he was enduring, he carried a private darkness while performing under the brightest lights the sport could offer. He did it largely alone, in a world that gave men like him nowhere to turn. Understanding that today only deepens our respect for what he managed to accomplish. He was a man who fell and rose, again and again. He rose after the trouble of his youth. He rose after the crushing knockout in Sweden. He rose after each private collapse to step back into the ring and prove, one more time, that he belonged among the greats. That rhythm of falling and rising ran through the whole of his life, right up until the one fall from which he could not rise. Eddie Machen deserves to be remembered as more than a sad ending in a San Francisco apartment. He deserves to be remembered as the disciplined craftsman from Reading who outthought the toughest men in the sport, who went the distance when no one else could, and who fought his hardest battles far from any arena. Behind every forgotten record stands a human being carrying more than the world ever knew. And Eddie Machen, the man who went the distance, carried more than most. May his story and the quiet courage inside it finally receive the remembering it has long deserved.